Welcome to a three-way comparison between three of the latest 2 Series BMWs. We're currently sitting in a 2023 G42 generation BMW 230i, and we'll be comparing this against the M240i, also of the G42 generation, and then finally the G87 M2. And the way these three examples have been spec'd out couldn't be more ideal. $46,000 MSRP for this 230i, $57K for the M240i, and then $68K for the M2. So with each jump up, there's $11,000 of difference in the MSRP. So this 230i is the most basic 2 Series you can buy currently. It comes with the B48 2-liter turbocharged inline 4-cylinder engine, making 255 horsepower and 295 pound-feet of torque. 8-speed ZF automatic transmission. The other 2 cars also have an 8-speed auto, and unlike the M240i and M2, this does not have a limited slip differential. All 3 of these cars are rear-wheel drive. Of course, you can also spec the 230i and M240i with the xDrive all-wheel drive system, but I'm glad that these are actually the more pure, lighter weight rear-wheel drive versions. And although this car is the least powerful, has fewer cylinders, and doesn't have an LSD, it's also the lightest by quite a bit. Curb weight is rated at just over 3,500 pounds, whereas the M240i is closer to 3,700 pounds, and that M2 is over 3,800 pounds. I just drove a Nissan R35 GTR this morning, and that car was criticized heavily for being so heavy, and yet nowadays, the smallest performance BMW you can buy weighs about the same. So we have strut front, multi-link rear suspension, electric power steering. This is a compact car, but from inside it's actually quite spacious and comfortable. The interior does feel very high quality even for the price point of $46,000. Nice leathers, soft touch plastics, super comfortable power adjustable seats, stitched leather on the doors. It's a nice place to be. So let's start by driving this car and then see what each additional increase of $11,000 really gets you. Fully digital dash and infotainment, very crisp and responsive touchscreen, but I'm not a huge fan of just the ergonomics of it. Thankfully, this is a touchscreen. You don't have to use this rotary dial here. For this car, it's as simple as putting into sport mode, although you can configure this individual sport mode here, steering into sport, drivetrain sport plus, transmission sport plus, basically the most aggressive for everything. We do not have adaptive dampers with the 230i. Very thick rimmed steering wheel. The lightest rear wheel drive 2 Series you can get. 3,500 pounds. Well, immediately, very quiet engine. This B48 does make a lot of torque, especially down low, but it doesn't make a lot of sound. The suspension, not having adaptive dampers, it does feel quite soft here. Brake pedal feels really good. Doesn't have a ton of feedback, but still pretty easy to modulate. Now there's where you feel the lack of an LSD. Coming out of corners, even in 3rd gear, because there's so much torque, if you're too aggressive and early with your throttle application, it's not that the rear end doesn't have traction, but it's more that you don't quite get that rotation that you might want from a rear-wheel drive BMW. The ZF 8-speed transmission, very smooth, reasonably quick, certainly no dual clutch in terms of shift speed, but it definitely gets the job done. It's a very refined powertrain and transmission combo. In the mid-corner here, you do feel the weight of the car. It's not a lightweight little coupe, and yet this is the lightest of the 3 that we're going to drive. Now this engine that revs to over 6,500 RPM, but you do feel that power start to die off near the red line. But that's what you'd expect, given this makes significantly more torque in terms of number of pound-feet compared to horsepower. This is a efficiency and low-end torque tuned engine. The nice thing though is that this engine is mostly mounted behind the front axle, and given that this is the lightest car at just over 3,500 pounds, might it also be the most nimble. Even though we don't have that throttle adjustability on corner exit, the turn-in is actually quite good. The corner entry of this car does feel really impressive. The steering though, numb. Very lightweight, even in Sport Plus. Just not much information coming through. The straight line performance is adequate. Now going around some of these third gear corners, you do feel the rear end move around a little bit, but it's more vertical motion. It's not that it really wants to step out. It's still a very safety focused handling balance. It's just that because the suspension is so soft, ultimately it's meant for everyday driving, it doesn't give you the most confidence mid-corner. Also, there are a few little creaks and squeaks from the interior that actually reminds me of my old E39 BMW. Not nearly as bad here, obviously, being a much newer car, but something about these BMW interiors have always been, I mean, they look good, they feel good when you touch the materials, but then when you actually drive the car over an uneven surface, they make noise. 20 plus years ago that was the case, and it's still the case now. Fun little car though to throw around. The front does feel pretty light. That's always been one of the big pros of these B48 powered cars. Even the Supra, although I haven't driven the B48 Supra yet, a lot of reviewers have mentioned that there's a significant difference in nimbleness in the tighter corners compared to the B58 versions. But overall, a very well-balanced little sports coupe. It's not going to wow you with its acceleration or its grip or even its engine sound, but this car doesn't really have any weaknesses. It's not meant to be a sports car. It's meant to be a fun, everyday driver. And I think it actually accomplishes that mission very, very well. And at $46,000, I actually think it's a bit of a bargain. Interior creaks and rattles aside, it's very refined, very little road noise, very little wind noise. Suspension's nice and supple. I really have very little to complain about for this car's intended purpose. But what happens when you spend an extra $11,000 to get the 6-cylinder version with the fake M badge? Is it an $11,000 more exciting driving experience? Let's find out. All right, we're now in the 2025 BMW G82 generation M240i. This is owned by my friend Alex, and he mentioned that he has done absolutely nothing to this car in terms of mods. That means we're powered by the B58 engine, same engine shared in the latest GR Supra, same state of tune as well, making 382 horsepower, 369 pound-feet of torque. 3-liter, twin-scroll turbo, straight 6, and it's just such a good engine. Whether you think it's emotional or exciting or has a great sound, that aside, it's really effective at what it does, which is giving a super broad torque curve and plenty of power throughout the rev range. That being said though, this car weighs close to 3,700 pounds in this configuration. We have the ZF 8-speed auto. You can't get any non-M2 current generation 2 Series with a manual, which is a shame. But at least this comes with the BMW M Sport differential, which is the same diff found in the GR Supra. Same engine, same transmission, same diff, but this car weighs a lot more. And even compared to that 230i, this weighs something like 150 pounds more. This comes with adaptive dampers as standard. You can flip it between comfort and sport. And we also have the ability to adjust the transmission shift speed. So let's fire this thing up and see if this is really that much better to drive than the $11,000 cheaper 230i. This is Sport Individual, so we've got the damping in Sport. Steering, I tried it earlier in Sport, and it's just artificially heavy for no reason, so we'll leave it in Comfort. Drivetrain Sport Plus, transmission Sport Plus. Interior feels essentially the same, although this piece across the dash is a different design. I actually quite like this. It's a little bit more subtle, and it has a nice brushed metal look to it. And the steering wheel, we have this flat bottom with a red stripe on top. And one other thing I noticed is that this car has no squeaks and rattles from the interior. I don't know if they actually built the M240i with a different level of build quality compared to the 230i, but I'm pretty sure they didn't. So it may just come down to the fact that this is a 5,000 mile 2025 model year versus that 2023 230i. You know, I said that 230i has a lot of torque, but this is next level. This engine is such a powerhouse. It's the highlight of this car. Wow, this is rapid. The fact that this is slower than the M2 is kind of wild. Quite sensitive throttle response in Sport Plus. You know, this engine's still relatively quiet, although it does definitely make a nicer sound than that coarse little 4-cylinder. This is much smoother, as an inline 6-cylinder should be. You know, the other thing I'm noticing is that these adaptive dampers in the stiffer setting feel really good. I think BMW's latest generation of adaptive suspension, they've really nailed the formula. Even though this only has 2 settings, Comfort and Sport, there's a very noticeable difference between the two. And in Sport, it's dialed in really well for aggressive driving without being overly harsh. The body control here is noticeably better compared to the 230i. Also, I feel like the transmission tuning in this version is a little more impressive. A little bit quicker in terms of the shifts. Good brake feel. Do I notice the extra weight? 150 pounds or so, which mostly will be up at the front of the car. Honestly, at canyon speeds, there's not that big of a difference. This car actually feels relatively nimble for its size and weight. I do think the turn-in response is slightly dull compared to the 230i, but you have to be pushing both cars quite hard to actually notice the difference. But what I do notice with the M Sport differential here, on corner exit, the car just puts the power down better, and you can actually use the throttle to get a little bit of rotation, although this car still does default to safety understeer. It's not a super playful rear-wheel drive car. We are overworking the tires a bit here. Ultimately, this is still a heavy car. You feel the mass in the corners. Actually hear the tires squealing away in some of these corners. I do think the 230i has a bit more of a delicate feel to it because of that lighter front end. But again, you have to be pushing the cars pretty hard to notice a significant difference. This front end still holds on. It's just that the limit feels slightly lower, even with the improved suspension, which I think does give this car much better body control. But I am glad this comes with the LSD as standard, because it really needs it with this much power. Definitely, I give the suspension to this. By far, it's the better setup with these adaptive dampers. There is some understeer. I think the front tires are starting to give out. It's understeering more compared to the first few minutes I drove it. Take it a little easier in the corners. Did not have that problem with the 230i. The brakes still feel good though, thankfully. No fade at all. It's just the front end feels a bit dull here. Initially, it didn't feel like that big of a difference, but now I can definitely feel it. So the question between these two cars becomes, do you prefer that nimbler, more responsive front end, or do you prefer the extra power, smoothness of this engine combined with the superior suspension tuning? Because in comfort mode, I would say this is just as comfortable as the 230i's fixed suspension. But in sport mode, the damping just feels so much better here. All right, let's throw it into comfort, automatic, super serene, super quiet. This engine at low RPM, low throttle application is just as refined, if not more refined, than that B48. So very clear pros and cons of this versus the base 230i. It's more about front end handling versus rear end handling in the case of this car, and the difference in the engines. But what happens when we go full fat M2? Is that car the best of both worlds, or are there still compromises when you go to the top dog 2 Series? Let's find out. All right, last but not least, 2024 G87 M2, the full fat M car. This car's got just over 20,000 miles on it, and the owner Aaron has pretty much kept it stock. This car is powered by the S58 engine. It's a 3-liter twin turbocharged straight 6, unlike the single twin scroll turbo of the B58. This one is a lot more high strung. It makes 453 horsepower and 406 pound-feet of torque. 8-speed ZF transmission. Interior does feel a bit more special here. The steering wheel has carbon fiber on it. There's just a lot more carbon fiber in general across the dash, in the center console, even this cover here, carbon fiber. Definitely a noticeably more purposeful interior, but the bones are the same. Although one thing I did notice, I don't know if it's due to the mileage, but this one creaks even more than the 230i. There's actually a creak from somewhere in this area, the dash or the center console, or maybe it's the screen, but it was driving me insane driving up the hill. Only Alex's car, the M240i with only 5,000 miles, was free of squeaks and rattles. Not a great sign for long-term 2 Series ownership. So being the M2 and having this auto, this car is the heaviest of the three at just over 3,800 pounds. But we do have a proper limited slip differential, adaptive suspension, and a lot more adjustability in terms of the drive mode. So let's get this thing fired up. So as you can see, I've got it in the setup screen here. So for engine and chassis, which is suspension, we have 3 settings now versus only 2 in the M240i. So we're gonna actually put it into M2 mode. Engine in Sport Plus, chassis will go Sport for the time being, steering and brake in Sport. Yes, this has adjustable brake feel or sensitivity because it is brake-by-wire. And then you can go into the M traction control where you have a 10-stage adjustable traction control system. We're just gonna put it into +1, just for a little bit of assistance. This shifter is also different. We have an actual gear lever. We can put this into manual mode. So there's 2 buttons on the shifter itself, which, as you can see, you can adjust between 3 different shift speed settings. Obviously, we'll go max. I think that's all the settings here. Let's see how this drives. Also worth pointing out, tire setup between these 3 cars. The 230i had 225 section width square. The M240i had 225 in the front, 255 in the back, which explains why it understeered so much. And this M2 has 275 in the front, 285 in the back. And the rear wheel is also 1 inch sized up in diameter. All right, right away, this car has so much more top end power. This engine is much more frantic at the top end. It revs to over 7,000 and there's less mid-range torque, at least relative to the rest of the power band, if that makes sense. The B58 felt flat throughout the torque curve. The B48 actually felt more powerful in the mid-range, whereas it died off at the top end. This is the other way around. It's all about the top end. But here's the other thing I'm noticing. This suspension setup, even in sport, is not overly stiff. Actually, I think it does provide really good damping overall. But compared to those other two cars, this is noticeably stiffer. Actually, let's try comfort. Even in comfort mode for the suspension, this feels stiffer than the M240i in sport. All right, let's actually try Sport Plus. Most aggressive setting for everything. First gear. Oh yeah. The transmission tuning for this ZF8 is much more aggressive compared to those other two cars. There's a noticeable jump up in transmission speed with each level of 2 Series. This has borderline dual clutch levels of shift speed, and it gives you that punch on the upshift that the other two don't. But one thing I'm not enjoying here is just the vagueness of this front end. Actually, this car feels more nervous mid-corner than the other two. Let's actually dial it all the way back into comfort and see if this can at least match the M240i in sport mode as far as compliance goes. The shifts are actually pretty violent here. Oh yeah, the way this diff is tuned, along with the suspension and the tire setup, means this car is a lot more willing to rotate on throttle because there's so much more front grip compared to the others. Okay, the car started to step out in a very snappy way, but then the traction control system on stage 1 out of 10 immediately whipped me back, but it almost kind of overcompensated. But yes, even in comfort chassis setting, which is the suspension, this car is stiff. And the stiffer you go, the more it exacerbates the creaks and rattles from the interior. There's actually not just creaks from this area, but also I can hear it from the doors. Really reminiscent of my old E39. Oh yeah. Very close gear ratios, which is needed for this engine because it's so peaky. The B58 can get away with longer ratios, but this definitely needs it to be closely spaced to take advantage of this engine. This car just feels like a brute. So much power. It has a good amount of grip, but it's so lively. It makes you work for the performance. Again, we have it in comfort chassis right now, but it still feels a bit unstable, which is interesting because the last time I drove one of these cars out here, I compared it to an F57 M2 and thought that the G87 felt like by far the more confidence-inspiring car. But relative to the M240i and the 230i, this feels like an untamed beast. The peakiness of the engine, the violent shifts from the ZF8, and the ultra-firm suspension tuning, along with the just vague front end of this car. I really can't feel anything through the steering. It makes for a bit of a nerve-wracking driving experience in the canyons. You can dial it back, take it out of M mode, but it's definitely less daily friendly because of that suspension tuning. Is it harsh? No, it's just that relative to those other two cars, which are not full M cars, this is a bit more compromised in terms of streetability. So let me know what you think about this comparison. For the extra $11,000 for each jump, do you get your money's worth in terms of performance, but also just driving pleasure? I would argue the sweet spot might be getting an M240i, giving it a square wheel and tire setup, maybe 255 or 265 square. I liked the dynamics of the M240i the most out of these three cars in the first 5 minutes of driving, but in the second half, those poor 225 width front tires just basically gave out. The 230i is fun, but the engine just is a letdown. It doesn't have much of a top end at all. It dies out towards its red line, doesn't make the greatest sound, and the suspension is just too soft for hard driving. This M2, on the other hand, everything is turned up to 12 or 13 out of 10. It's definitely by far the fastest and grippiest and most capable out of these three. It's not even close. But in my opinion, it's just a bit too nervous and numb feeling because everything just becomes so sensitive. But I think in terms of driving pleasure, the 240i with the understeer issue fixed would be my pick. And I think at $57,000, it finds that right balance as well. If you want a car that can be driven every single day in comfort, but still have a blast on a canyon road, as a sporty coupe, not a full-on track car, I think it gets the job done the best. So a big shout out to Diane, Alex, and Aaron for letting me review these 2 Series BMWs. Let me know how you think they compare. Thank you guys for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.